I was born in Deadwood, of course, and in Deadwood, you know, someone didn't like the judge. Or the sheriff, for that matter. You know. My daddy always said, don't get into any card game unless the mayor and or the sheriff is there. Just in case you think I'm naive about how things really work. I was a pastor on the south side of Chicago. I also know the rule of law doesn't always work. But it's, believe me, it's better than in some places. But the rule of law doesn't always work. Okay, what else?
Cartesian philosophy.
Yeah, Cartesian philosophy. And as a matter of fact, Bob here went online and studied about Descartes. Found out that he went and was a pretty good dude with the Queen of Sweden. For his trouble, she decided to stay Catholic and moved to be taken care of by the Pope, because the Swedes, you know, wanted to be Lutheran. So she had to, you knew that, she had to get out of town. Which was a whole lot better than everybody in Sweden having to turn Catholic, right? Which would have been a little more difficult. Of course, well, no, I won't say anything about Swedes. Someone else? Oh, boy, thank you. I mean, modern dogma. I mean, that's what it was all about last week, right? What's important about the modern dogma? Now, you know, I'm going to take my jacket off already. Yeah.
There was kind of an agreement that you have separation between private and public, your faith and science.
Yeah.
It was
Good.
a general agreement.
Yeah, an agreement that makes America run. And why did that agreement get created? It was a reaction to what?
100 Years War.
Yeah, 100 years of war. Not to be confused with the 100 Years War, which was a century and 25 years before that in England and France. But 100 years of war following the first settlement between the Catholic and Protestant powers after the Reformation, trying to figure out what to do when now all of a sudden we don't have a shared religious system to form our public life, our civil order. And for 100 years we killed each other over it, which was a fairly ineffective technique. Wouldn't you say? It does, yeah. I mean, it's not an effective technique. Yeah, that solution. Yeah.
So, is our Constitution was developed before the modern dogma?
No, it was created by, the modern dogma created it.
So why are we having such problems with and confusions about what's public and what's secular and what's faith?
Well, first of all, some of us are, and some of us aren't. Huge pressures that are vastly changing the shape of, first of all, who makes up Americans. For most of our history, you know, Christians could say, oh yeah, we separate our faith from the public life because everyone who ran the place was just like us. Right? You know, we've only had one president until this most recent one who wasn't either English or Irish. That was Eisenhower. I knew you thought I was going to say Kennedy, but he of course was Irish. What made him different was he was the only Catholic president we've had. They've all been men. And on the whole, they all represent basically the original kind of agreement on how the world should look. Now, one Christian, not one variety or another. But now, all of a sudden, the nature of our population is such that we can't have that kind of quiet, oh yes, we'll pretend like religion doesn't have anything to do with the public space, but of course run it. Now, especially, you know, first of all, Catholics, then Jews, and now Muslims, and then if you're on the West Coast, you have a massive number of very significant people in public life who are Buddhist, Hindu, and they don't share much with those notions of public space.
You mentioned people being Muslim. What's the difference between Muslim and Islam?
None. It depends on who's talking and about what. Most Muslims prefer to be called Muslim. Islam is, on the whole, a technical term invented in the West to describe it. It's just like there isn't such a thing actually as Hinduism. What there is literally hundreds of very complex traditions that happen to be in India that 19th century European scholars, mostly British, decided to call Hindu because what they shared was mostly that language, though not only that language. So the very serious scholars of Indian religion will say, well, this sort of notion of religion as some big overarching thing is, of course, a European notion, right? And not one that India actually shares. And if you ever been to visit India or get to know knowledgeable Indians, they will talk about how local and complex and multiple the religious systems are. But, you know, we tend to do that, right? We tend to build analogies on the basis of what we know. And that's not wrong, because what's the other option? Right? Build analogies on what we don't know? Not doable, right? You always have to build an analogy on the basis of what you do know. And just hopefully you start interacting with people who don't have the same ones, so you can learn something, right? But it is, the only way for a human being to know is by analogies to what they already know. It's just the way, well, there are no other option. God may be able, or the angels, or some extraterrestrials, might be able to do it differently. I don't know. It's above my pay grade. But for us, that's the only way human beings know. It's on the basis of ourselves and our experience. Other things you remember?
Lutheranism, the Protestant Reformation was given a reprieve by Suleiman
Yeah.
in effect.
Yeah. There wouldn't have been an effective Reformation without the Muslims. Suleiman the Magnificent held up the Roman party for over 30 years. They would have cleaned our clock, but they needed us dumb Germans to go fight for them against the Muslims. That's actually how they referred to us, so, you know, they didn't think much of Germans.
Pat, you made
You
that.
mentioned, and we all know, we have Lutheran schools, we have Catholic schools,
Yeah.
Baptist colleges, etc. Most of them. Do they have any colleges?
I think we're going to start seeing that more as they begin to, they certainly have religious schools here for the training of imams,
Right.
but they haven't yet, to my knowledge, done a full-blown university. But I would expect fairly soon. The oil-rich countries in the Muslim world put a lot of money into certain American universities. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, one of my teachers was a man by the name of Rahman, who's an absolutely brilliant Muslim scholar, a Saudi, who was, if he had returned to Saudi Arabia, he would lose his head because he was a heretic. And they take their heresy very seriously there. One of the families of the ruling family, the Faisal family, came and wanted to give $45 million to the University of Chicago to found a Muslim institute. But the deal was they wouldn't give it unless, you know, Rahman left the faculty. And the Jews went, you know, that was a real relief because they were not ready to deal with, you know, the University of Chicago, which was founded by who? Baptists. paid for cash on the barrelhead by John D. Rockefeller himself. $42 million in 1892. Cold cash. Built the place. Cold cash. Well, Stanford was founded by Leland Stanford the same way. Cold cash, just a few years later. I mean, you know, when $1 million actually was money. He put $42 million down and went and got this Baptist guy who was teaching at Johns Hopkins and said, I want to find myself a university and I want you to be the president. His name was William Rainey Harper, Baptist preacher. And Reverend Harper said, sounds like a good idea to me. I'll take your $42 million. And that's why the Divinity School is right in the center of the University of Chicago. Pretty amazing. So the Baptist presence, shall we say, is extremely light. And the others, as they had constantly complained, the only thing John D. Rockefeller didn't give us was the one thing we wanted, his name. Right? They wanted to call it Rockefeller University, not the University of Chicago. John?
Yeah, you said last time that the phrase or expression separation of church and state is not in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's not.
Which comes as a surprise to some of us, because it would seem that if the Constitution is sort of a child of the modern dogma, that even if it didn't say that, it would, in effect, the content would establish separation of. Can you comment more on that?
Yeah, it's one of the most complex questions in, I think, interpretation of First Amendment. Because the first thing that's protected in the First Amendment is what? Speech. Religion. Speech is second. Everyone thinks, and that's a very 20th century, especially post-Second World War belief, that everything's based on free speech. No. The founding brothers believed the most important thing to protect was religious affections. And to make sure the state didn't establish a church. But the first thing they want was free exercise clause, it's called. That these citizens will be free to exercise religion. Then secondly, Congress shall establish no law establishing a church. Establishing religion. What? A state church, right. But the assumption was religion would flourish. Jamie Madison, who was a Presbyterian, deeply believed in the checks and balances system. And he borrowed from his Presbyterian heritage the three-part government. Because for 200 years, the Presbyterians had been organizing their church life that way. When they replaced the power of the bishop, in Scotland, they replaced it with three things. One, the presbytery, which was all of the people in that area were the presbytery, what we call a synod. They call it presbytery, and they take that word from the word presbyteros, which means elders. Two, an executive presbyter, or general presbyter, who would function in some sort of an executive role. The presbytery function is the legislative, the executive presbyter in some sort of executive role. But he could not, or she could not, even chair the meetings. Only a moderator could chair the meetings, not the executive. And then the judiciary. So for 200 years before the U.S. Constitution, the Presbyterians, and then also the Reformed in their own way on the continent, had put together a different way of governing themselves. And Madison borrows from that to create this notion of checks and balances that's at the heart of the U.S. Constitution. It's a gift of the Reformed Church. So we literally order ourselves according to Reformed order. That's just how deeply Reformed the U.S. is, saying. Now, and I'm not saying that's bad, you understand? That was a great gift. But it just indicates just how deeply indebted the country was to Reformed thought.
Which other church besides the Pentecostals did you say was growing?
Catholic.
Catholic and Pentecostals.
Yeah, by the present growth rates within 10 years, the two of them will make up 45% of the people, each 45% of the people who show up in the church. With the present rates continue. That, of course, depends a lot on Lutherans continuing to die as fast as we are. Which, by all evidence, we seem to be in a hurry. Yeah.
Is the Mormon faith growing quickly? Or is that just
They're
my
growing.
answer because it's not Christian? Okay.
No, the Mormon Church is growing. They think they're Christian.
Yeah.
And they're growing so fast that if they were to continue this pace, and we were to compare where they are in their historical development to where Christianity was, they will replace Christianity as the normative form of Christianity. If it's just pure demographics, of course. You know, the one thing we know about the future is it'll be different than the past. So.
What about all the Lutherans in Africa?
Yep, and they're over. They're growing very fast there. I was talking about North America. But there, it gets pretty complicated. I mean, I have 3 Africans in my doctoral seminar who are Lutheran. I've got Anglican and a couple that are a part of what's called the African indigenous churches, which is the fastest growing form of Christianity in Africa. And of those 3, 2 of them are what I would call European-based Lutherans. That is, they kind of think the way European Americans think as Lutherans. And the 3rd, who's the youngest and a part of the majority in his country of Lutherans, which is Kenya, is Pentecostal. I can't tell the difference between him and any other Pentecostal. And that's the dominant form of Lutheranism now that's growing, is Pentecostal Lutheranism in Africa.
What exactly is Pentecostal Lutheranism compared to?
Huge emphasis upon the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit, discernment within the Spirit, worship services that would look more like a Church of God in Christ than anything you would recognize. Speaking in tongues, healing is common in the worship service. Laying on of hands, all the things, you know, my mother was taught in confirmation, the Holy Rollers did. And as she said, her pastor said, if you went to a Holy Rollers meeting, make sure you sit in the back, because they might beat you to death. But, you know, the ever open-minded Lutheran Church. Which gets us to our topic tonight. You know, given this situation that I've described, which is a messy one, right? On the one hand, there's this agreement that we Americans took into our very polity, that is the way we organize ourselves as people. It's now pretty messy, isn't it? And it's getting messier how to relate religion to the public space. Huh? I mean, look at probably the most influential presidential debate last year was sponsored by Saddleback Church, right? Both presidential candidates came and answered questions and engaged in conversation with Rick Warren, a Baptist preacher. Right? Think about it. CNN ran it, and it was the most watched debate, presidential debate. My daughter, doctoral student, the only person who was sitting and watching it who was even vaguely a Christian, as she said, you know, the only one even knew what organized religion was, and she says, I'm not sure Lutheranism is organized, but you know. Here were all of these graduate students. listening to both candidates for the presidency talk about what Jesus meant to him, right? Right? Not vaguely, but very specifically, huh? Well, when I was a kid, I never would have believed that to happen. Would have you? No. We're living in a very complex time with respect to how it's clear it would have been illegal if the federal government had sponsored that, right? But there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that wouldn't do anything but encourage a church to do it. Do you see my point? So there's absolutely nothing within the Constitution except sentences which would encourage a church to participate in that way. All the Constitution says is that the state can't do it, right? This is interesting, huh? I think. I mean, just purely as a matter. Now, our temptation in the face of Islam especially, because on the whole, the Islamic tradition, as it developed in the West, for one reason or another, this is a matter of such huge debate, I'm not competent to even articulate it right, but for some reason or another, decided not to accept the modern dogma, decided not to agree to not have the state established on religious grounds, right? Up until that time in the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam basically were developing together in their way of conceiving of these issues. When Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, very influential, if not the most important mind put to the Christian theological task in Western history, studied theology in what eventually became Spain, but at the time it was Toledo. He had teachers who were Muslims, Jews, and Christians in his degree in theology, and this wasn't exceptional. And the most important philosophical contribution to Thomas Aquinas' work, and he is the main influence on the Roman Catholic Church officially, is Aristotle, which Christians had not preserved. The only people who preserved Aristotle were the Muslims. Two very, very important Muslim scholars, Ibn Sena and Eva Royes, which just simply means son of Sen and son of Ro, and they were the ones who preserved Aristotle. And therefore, Aristotle was a new set of ideas for Western Christians in the 13th century. And they got it from the Muslims. Our whole math system, as you know, was basically a Muslim math system. It was brought into the West through those intellectuals. So there was a time where there was lots of interaction and there wasn't this sort of animosity. But part of what happens with the development of the nation state, the Reformation, and this development of modernity, the Muslims say no thanks. We're not going to go with the Christian solution. So now we face, for all sorts of complex reasons, a very large, intelligent, competent, vibrant, growing, very missionary movement called Islam that doesn't agree to the rules of modernity. They just go, thanks, but no thanks. It's no solution. And one can understand why they would. At least I can. It doesn't take rocket science to see why you'd want a different position. It doesn't mean I agree with it, but I can certainly understand. It is essentially the same solution that Israel has. So before we say it's just Muslim, it's also in a state that we will this week, put it all on the line to support, right? So these things become very complex. And this is a time where Christians, I think, precisely in their identity as Christians, can lead the way to offer an alternative way of conversation that doesn't go through the state. Let me give you the grossest example I know. Ever since 1998, I've been a consultant to the Mennonites, helped them merge into the Mennonite Church USA and the Mennonite Church Canada, and been very active in Mennonite Central Committee, which is their primary way of doing what our LWF and LWR, Lutheran World Relief, does. And they have, the most recent consulting gig I've done is trying to help them resolve the difference between the Canadian Mennonites and the US Mennonites, because they developed a very close relationship following a series of terrible earthquakes in northern Iran with Iranian villages. They just went in to help the people, right? And as is the want of Mennonites, they stay. And so now you have these Mennonites who are in all these villages, and they, over the last 30 years, they've become very close friends with a number of imams, and some of these imams have made their way to the top now at Qum, which is the most influential conservative seminary for the mullahs and imams of Iranian culture. And 3 of these imams, who are now very influential, have advanced degrees in peacemaking from Mennonite schools in the United States. And they have extremely high trust in these Mennonites. And in these Mennonites, they experience believers who believe in a God as strongly and as forcefully and their manner of life is so profoundly affected that these Muslims say, hey, you know, we have more in common than a lot of the Christians we encounter who don't really think God does anything. Right? And furthermore, these Christians have given their lives to caring for the least amongst us, and the Quran says such people are blessed. So they have been carrying on dialogues, theological dialogues, that have included Mr. Ahmadinejad and his 2 chief imams. And you might imagine that the NSA and the CIA and several other people who work for the government are a little irritated. And so whenever these Mennonites should come home, they get visited. And, you know, more than, shall we say, interviewed. Well, of course. Think of what they know that our government would love to know, because our government doesn't know, you understand, about how things really work in Iran. We don't. Henry Kissinger, in his 2nd volume of his memoirs, and I advise you to read all 3, he's a great writer, and of course he is the hero in all his stories, but face it, he's a pretty, you know, he's a pretty interesting hero, right? So, I mean, it's not boring stuff, even though, you know, Richard Nixon's kind of a second-rate, you know, that he helps out. Anyway, 2nd volume, he says, look at the American intelligence community and the American intellectual community were put into a state of shock when Iran went Muslim. Here they were, we put our boy and his daddy on the throne, right? The Shah of Iran and his daddy, starting back in '53. Their per capita income was greater than the US's because of all the oil. They took care of their kids from the womb to the tomb, all the education they ever wanted paid for by the government. Their economy was as strong as any economy in the world. In other words, all the things that liberal, secular American scholars believe would make sure that a society state, liberal and secular, were in place in Iran. Right? And these people choose a dirty raghead from the suburbs of France He returns and the entire country goes upside down in its excitement, right? And no one, he said, was more surprised than the American intellectual community who had no idea what to do with this influence of religion on a modern state. We thought religion was for the poor, the stupid, and the left out. We figured it would pass away. And it was not a major player in the politics of the future. Everything was about economic life, right? We believed. And the politics that came out of it. And instead, all of the Middle East has gone up in smoke, right? And our intellectual community doesn't have the intellectual smarts to figure out what the role of religion is in this new world. You understand? Read them. You just want to laugh because the other thing is to cry. They have no idea what to do. What are you going to do with this? Yeah, it's the Arab Spring. But do you think any of those countries aren't going to be Muslim countries? Every one of them will be, right? They see no contradiction between democracy and a religious state, any more than Israel does. And what are we going to do about it, right? There's nothing we can do about it, right? They got us by the short hairs of their oil, right? Here is an opening for Christians, an incredible opening for Christians, precisely as Christians and not a part of the state, okay? To demonstrate that we too can enter into real conversation like those Mennonites do with our Muslim neighbors, with those people who come from genuinely different faiths. We can make a strategic, a massive strategic role in creating peace if we take the initiative. Do you understand? Now, why would Lutherans want to do that? This is the advertisement for Lutherans. Because there's very, very good theological reasons that Lutherans would want to do this and do it in ways that other forms of Christian faith might not. The dominant tradition in the West, and by the West I mean those countries that were Latin in the ancient Roman Empire versus Greek, because the Roman Empire split in half between Greek speakers and Latin speakers, was a fellow by the name of Aurelius Augustinus. We know him as Augustine or Augustine. He lived in the beginning of the 5th century when the Roman Empire was falling apart in the West. And he wrote some very basic books that became basically the books for how we formed our society in the West. Because they were about the only ones to survive through the Middle Ages. Politically, probably the most important book is The City of God. I have had students come on Fulbrights to the University of Minnesota to study Augustine who are in architecture and urban planning. Because what they figured out is a lot of the ways European cities were designed were out of Augustine's design of the City of God. Well, why does the city get designed the way it is? You know, they're not all the same, right? What is the European city? And you've all lived in enough places or seen enough places in the world that one city is not the next. And what's the imagination that forms a city? So Augustine basically did theology by first establishing sin and then talking about grace. Okay? And that's the tradition both in Catholicism and in the Reformed tradition. Calvin was heavily influenced by Augustine, and of course Thomas Aquinas basically simply perfected the arguments of Augustine, and Thomas is the primary thinker for Catholicism. Luther is the odd person out in the Western tradition. He's much more like the Greeks on these issues. He says, no, what you need to do is do law and promise. when you do theology. If you're going to think about sin, are you going to first think about God, or are you going to think about human beings? Sure, right. So in the Augustinian tradition, the first thing you do is you got to come up with a technical term, theological anthropology. Anthropology is the word for theory of the human. Theological is the theological theory of the human. Sin is a subset of that. While for Luther, you start, and I'm going to erase Luther's name here. With two words of God, law and promise, which are only present to us by way of creation. We have no access to God for Luther but by way of the creation. That's how God is given to us. And God gives God's self to us with two words, law and promise. So, for Luther, can't see any of these trees out here in French Park, but according to John Locke, the guy who mostly forms the legal tradition on property in America and in England, if you look at a tree and you ask the question, what gives that tree value? The modern answer is my labor, what I make of it. If I make a house, and if I make a park, that has value too, right? And the market will establish its value on the basis of my labor. Makes sense, right? It's what all we Americans believe, right? Luther, on the other hand, has this silly notion that when you look at a tree, you're looking at not nature, which I can act upon and master, but a fellow creature in a garden in which I am the last thought that the main gardener even thought of. And the only reason I am created was to care for the tree. Now, is that a different relationship with the tree? Yeah, I should say so. And furthermore, Luther, medieval man that he was, actually thought trees gave meaning, had ideas, felt. I know we go, oh, you know, boy, we're glad we don't believe in that stupid superstition, right? But Luther actually thought trees gave meaning to life. Not just trees, but all the rest of the creatures in the garden, right? Seems odd to us moderns. So, the value of that tree is grounded where for Luther? In God, right? The one who stands behind the value of the tree is the creator, and it's the same one who creates me. Changes how I should think about the tree, wouldn't you think? What's even more interesting is Luther believes that this law happens just in the very business of being alive. That the law, God's speaking. See, it's this very interesting notion he had. He wasn't the only one. It was a tradition in the Middle Ages too, but a minority position. That God speaks every single moment into existence. If God hiccuped, we'd have a hiccup in creation. Doesn't that seem weird? It's just so cool. And you know, but who in the world could ever believe it, right? We've got a God, I don't know, someplace, wound the universe up and let it go, right? Maybe sticks her fickle finger into, you know, once in a while, but the data we have on the average Lutheran in the ELCA is everyone believes in God, everyone believes God does something, but when they describe their everyday life, God never does anything. That we're practical atheists, right? I mean, we all believe in God, right? You're all pious, good Christians, you're all going to heaven. That's not what we're talking about here. What I'm interested in is how do you live? And when you tell me a story or one of your neighbors a story, when we interview you, when you talk about your ordinary life, is God doing anything? And less than 5% of the time, when we interviewed literally now hundreds of thousands of Lutherans, is God ever the subject of a sentence with an active verb? That's what I call practical atheism. Right? So, and believe me, that's the main thing Muslims have problems with modern Christians, is their practical atheism. It's why they call us infidels. Do you understand? In my opinion, they're right. When they say we commit blasphemy, we don't even know what blasphemy is. We know what idolatry is. There were two big sins in the scriptures, right? Idolatry was taking something that was profane and treating it like it was God, right? So a piece of wood and we make it like God. Blasphemy is taking something that is sacred and treating it like it's profane. Is there anything we treat as sacred? No, of course not.
But don't you think that part of our accepting of the modern dogma and making faith part of our private life has led to that, our conversations?
Right, of course. They're same thing. Same thing. They're just hung together like a horse and carriage. And it's that, when I read someone like Saeed Khattab, who's the main intellectual behind Al-Qaeda, and I am not supporting anything in Al-Qaeda, but their main intellectual is this philosopher who did his doctorate in engineering at Colorado, the University of Colorado, the People's Republic of Boulder. And he said, Americans are infidels. They treat their women in a blasphemous manner. They look at their women as objects for sexual use. I'm sorry. He was at the University of Colorado in the 1960s. He looked and it's the way it was, right? I don't know about you, but I'll admit it. What 18-year-old boy in 1969 wasn't that way? At least none of the ones I didn't know, right? And they look at that and they're horrified, you understand? They say, this is unbelievable. They make cartoons of their God. They have pictures of the crucifix in a beaker filled with urine. And they say, that's blasphemy. Do you understand why they would say that? They print books that say that all of the 12 wives of the prophet were prostitutes. For a pious Muslim, that's blasphemy. And we just, say, oh, well, they're not modern. Well, they're not our kind of modern, right? One of the tough things, but I think we've got good theological grounds to do this as Lutherans, is to begin learning in the conversation with our Muslim neighbors about, okay, what is this stuff about blasphemy? I don't get it. And we don't, right? Learn. It's not a new idea, it's in the scriptures. The primary reason the Jews crucified Jesus was because he committed blasphemy. And what blasphemy did he commit? He said he can forgive sins. And the scribes and the Pharisees said, only God can forgive sins. And so the question is, was he or wasn't he, right? Blasphemy is a big deal. It's the grounds for the Jews rightly holding Jesus. If he was not God, he clearly blasphemed, right? We don't pay attention to this because we've lost this in the modern period. You want to talk about blasphemy with Rabbi Citron. We can talk a lot about that. They still believe in blasphemy in the Jewish tradition. Right, here's a place where we Lutherans can, I think, lead the way as people out of our heritage. This idea of law. Luther believed and the Lutheran confessions teach that God is hidden. Indeed, God even hides in the world under the law. That God is hiding under that tree. Luther says, when he goes for a walk at night and the wind blows and he hears the stirring of the leaves, he knows that God is walking with him. Now, you and I go, oh, nice metaphor. Okay, a clever metaphor. No, Luther believed it.
But does Luther believe God is the trees and God is the leaves and the wind?
No, God is the creator of all those and is intimately in every moment of their existence as created. They are creatures just like we are. And they're shaped by that word of God which is constantly being spoken.
Why are we using the word law when it seems like we're talking more about nature and creation?
Because that is Luther's notion of law, is it's first through creation.
Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, as St. Paul says, where is the law first written? In our hearts. Adam and Eve were born with it, created. As one Jewish writer interpreting Luther says, Luther understands we live in values. That all of creation is created with value, with law. It's a nomenological, that's the Greek word for law, existence. We're created with values. And that's, of course, what the law is, right? There is no creature that doesn't have value. And that value is grounded where? In their being a creature of God. They're all sacred. All of God's creatures, great and small, in this heritage, in the Christian heritage, are sacred. And not just because God made them at the beginning, because God is constantly creating every single moment. Life is a gift of God's speaking. All of it.
Does that mean that he also would be engaged in every human being that same way?
Yes.
Whether they're Muslim, Catholic, or whatever.
Exactly
God
right.
is there and present and
Or-
working in all of his.
Or someone who has no religious belief, right?
Right.
So for Luther, and this gets us to the next point, under the doctrine of the law, a Muslim, a person who has no faith, has real wisdom to teach us about God. He firmly believed that. Why? Because the law is written on all human hearts. I mean, there he's just following Paul and almost all the Old Testament scriptures, right? This isn't unique to Luther. Now, that knowledge can't save, right? That's what the promise is about, right? The promise of life in Jesus Christ is that unique gift of the church. It's the one ministry that the rest of the world doesn't have. That is to announce the forgiveness of sins in Jesus. That's a disputed sovereignty that Jesus can forgive sins, right? That's the unique gift of the church, the body of Christ, by the power of the Spirit and the will of the Father, is to announce that promised, unconditional promise of forgiveness of life in Jesus. Other than that, everything else we do is law. Still God's, but subject to the conversation and the need of actually knowing what other people believe. And there's real knowledge to be gained under the doctrine of the law.
Yeah. So I want to clarify something, because I was trying to remember back to my confirmation days, which was maybe a while ago. And I think
But good for you. This is straight out of the small catechism.
No, but I seem to have had this feeling that growing up, there wasn't that much difference between Lutheranism and Presbyterian. I mean, that in my mind, it was kind of like the Protestant part of the church and the Catholic part. It seemed like when I was growing up, there was a lot more emphasis on not those Catholics, but we're okay. You know how that goes, right?
I do, yeah.
But
Especially since my father was Catholic, and I'm named after my Italian uncle, Patricio. Yeah, I got that message real clear.
But is this unique to Luther, or is this unique to?
This is unique to Luther.
So that, I mean.
Luther is the odd person out in the West. Now, if we were going to talk about the Greek theologians, then there's agreement on these things with the Greeks. But in the West, Luther's the odd person out here.
So Wesley, all of those were more along the.
The Augustinian side. Right?
What do you mean by Greeks?
Oh, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Orthodox tradition. But we don't talk much to them, right? So, and in the country run by the Reformed, you can understand why immigrant Lutherans wanted to get along with them. Right? I mean, you can understand that. You wanted the job. Let's not get fancy about this. The evidence on this is overwhelming. I can point you to tremendous literature, the incredible bigotry, especially against Germans in Minnesota, and Lutherans. The founding of St. Olaf, Bishop Moose, who was the first president of St. Olaf, wore a mitre, had a crozier, and a chasuble. And the local reports, in English, of course, because the service was in Norwegian, said, these are papists, and we got to do something about it. And needless to say, those graduates of St. Olaf wanted jobs, so they got rid of that papism in a big hurry, right? They don't even, I mean, when this paper by one of my colleagues was written, he now is on the faculty at St. Olaf, and is a knight, was knighted by the King of Norway for his work in showing the immigration movement into this country. When that article first came out, let me tell you, there was running for cover in Northfield on the Hill. This is a deep crisis that the Lutherans met by becoming, especially the Norwegians changed their names to English names faster than any other in the 19th and early 20th century. The social, economic pressure to get rid of anything that looked like Catholicism was huge. And you can understand, right? I mean, anti-Catholicism is as American as apple pie.
So Lutheran, I mean, and I'm confused, so being Lutheran seemed to be Catholic?
Right, because we did the liturgy, right? Right, and we do. I'll never forget the first family picnic I went to on my wife's side of the family in Northwest Iowa. There were 300 and some of them. Someone obviously asked her grandmother what kind of, religion was I? Because of course I was the first pastor in that family, I guarantee you. And good Northwestern, Iowa farmers, plenty of corn, but not much religion. And she said, well, he's one of those Catholic-looking Protestants. I don't know. I would hurt her, And why? Because, on Sunday morning, I looked like a priest to her, right? Chasuble, stole. As my uncle says, once you get 14 in this family, you don't go to religion except for the two of you preachers, and you wear skirts on Sunday. So there's this, we're out here. But we have a wonderful opportunity in this doctrine of the hiddenness of God. Now there's two kinds of hiddenness, and you need to understand this. The one is often called hiddenness one, and this is God just in creation. God hides behind every single moment of the creation, creating it. But what we experience is the creation, huh? But if it weren't for God creating, what does Luther say in the Catechism? God daily provides me with all that I need, and then he gives a list of all these very ordinary things, right? Down to shoes. Now, this is the intimacy with which Luther understood the relationship between God and creation. But hiddenness in those very ordinary things. Then there is a hiddenness also in the promise, in who Jesus is. And that is when God, the reason God hides in the world is so that we'll look for him in Jesus, says Luther. So when we finally get to take a hold of him, eat him, drink him, have him as friend, it's in the form of Jesus. But even there, God hides under the opposite. For where we would expect a great and mighty conqueror, we get a lamb, right? Where we expect someone who comes to town and kicks out all the bad guys, we get a crucified Lord. Where we expect someone so immortal and invisible and God only wise, we get a baby, says Luther, who doesn't know and depends upon hay and swaddling clothes and a woman to feed him, and who is subject to the power of kings and had to get out of town in the middle of the night. As my 4-year-old said to me, I remember the first time she heard the story, because that mean King Herod would kill him. That's our God. Hidden under the very opposite of everything we think was godly, right? And why, says Luther. So, what he has rightly as God, we get, because it doesn't belong to us. But when we're made one with him, our death becomes his life, and our death becomes his, right? His immortality takes up our mortality. His sinlessness takes up our sin. Luther calls this the fröhliche Wechsel, the happy exchange. My teacher called it the sweet swap. This is why God hides, says Luther, so that when we find him, we don't find him in the impressive power moves and in all the glory, etc., all of which does belong properly to God. But we find him in a manger, dead on a cross, and unable to find him in an empty tomb. That kind of faith can afford to learn from other people, because we believe in a God who hides, right? And for a reason. And that we should not be ashamed if we can't explain everything that God's up to, right? This is not a shameful thing. People always say, how can it be? You know, I keep asking you questions and you're a theologian. You keep telling me that's above your pay grade. Aren't you a little embarrassed? And I said, no, that's my job to make sure. As a Lutheran theologian, we don't pretend to know more than we do. It's a sacred task in our heritage to call a thing what it is, says Luther. That's the theology of the cross. And not claim more than we have, but to let God be the one who claims us. You see the point? That actually frees us. If we've got that, really we don't have anything to fear in a conversation with persons of other faith, do we? There's nothing at stake. We've got everything you could possibly want, right? We got the sweet swap. What more could a person want? Thanks. So enjoy your conversation with all these people. There's nothing but good that could come of it if you open your heart, your minds, your imaginations, and just go with them. Listen well. There's a lot they can teach you. And you have nothing to lose by learning from them.
And we still have a couple minutes for questions. And I mean, just to recap, I think what you're suggesting then, Pat, is that through the law and creation, almost all that we experience, there's this incredible potential for common ground and conversation with everyone of different faiths who participate in the same law and creation that we do, and thereby
And
have
there's real gain to be had.
and thereby have access to God, at least in that way. That's a pretty powerful reality. I'm surprised by your comments about Islam. Do they have a more fully formed doctrine of the presence of God that leads to the sense of sacredness
They do, yes.
of creation? That
And
is
that's because-
somewhat akin to Luther?
Yeah, especially if you go to the Sufis, they have the same sort of mysticism. A lot of people, to insult Luther will say, oh, well, he was a mystic. Yeah, I suppose. I just call him a Christian. Christians believe there is this mystical presence of God, this deep mystery to life that makes all life sacred, right? I mean, Catholics believe that, the Orthodox believe that. This is not exceptional. The Sufis especially believe. They have this very mystical sense of the presence of the one who can only be breathed, yeah? Very interesting to talk with a Sufi. They tend not to be the ones who talk with us much, though, because, they're like Hasidic Jews. They're pretty happy to be by themselves, I've handed out both a little thing about who Church Innovations is, and every summer, I spend most of my summer in Yellowstone, and part of the time I invite people to come out in groups of 4 to 6 to retreat with me for 2 or 3 days, and then enjoy the park. I've been going to the park since I was 8, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. And if you're a fly fisher, I can especially put you on some great streams. But someone had their hand up here.
Well, it's just one thing. One of the things I think a lot of us get hung up on is who's going to go to heaven, especially when we get in conversations with non-Christians, and it's just a sticking point. And I mean, looking for the creation of God in each and every one. You don't focus on that, but it's
No, you don't. And as important as salvation in Jesus Christ is, for Lutherans, its purpose is for the sake of the world. Now, I actually think that's what Scripture says, right? But for God so loved just the people who would be saved? No. For God so loved the world, the Greek word is cosmos, that he gave his only begotten Son. The object of God's desire is the world, not just people who believe. That's patent in Scripture. I don't think that's really a highly debatable matter. So why would we change our attitude? You understand? Why would we, who have the gift of life in Jesus Christ, right? And it's a gift. We Lutherans say, we don't earn it. I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ or come to him. Third explanation of the third article in Luther's Small Catechism. That's a gift. I can't coerce you to do it. I can't even coerce myself to do it. I can't even trick myself to believe in Jesus, right? So why would I try to do that to a Muslim, right? For a Lutheran, it's truly an absurd act, right? For us, that's the work of the Holy Spirit, not the Christian's work. The Spirit makes Christians for Lutherans. Actually, I think the Spirit makes Christians for, in the Scripture, but I'm a Lutheran, so that's the way I read the Scripture, or I don't know which comes first. So what's at stake in our conversation with persons of other faith, I think, is listening for that hidden God and seeking genuine wisdom and truth. Because our salvation isn't that at stake, right? At all. And bearing witness to Jesus, believe me, when it's time to do that, and I've done it a lot, I'm often called, a revanchist evangelist, right? Kyle?
It's true.
Yeah, I mean, man, don't sit on me next to a plane, I kid you not. By the time we get there, it'll be an altar call. But, I'm not ashamed at all to say to someone, I'm authorized by Jesus himself to say, you're the lost coin, and he's been hunting for you all day. And I'm here to tell you, you belong to it. I don't have any problems with that. But the point of this whole thing is that Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, and we can afford, if we really believe that, to have a conversation with anyone seeking that truth, huh? We really can. Very precisely because of what we believe to be true, not because we have doubts about it. I need to go, but one more.
Well, I'm just making a comment then that I find very interesting, that because of that belief, instead of, so many times I find that even when I'm talking to Christians and other Christians, it's like when you're talking, they're actually formulating their next thought or their argument for you. You know, it's like, you believe, well, no, you can't believe that because it says, you know how that feeling.
If you think you're the one that's going to get them to believe, right, you got to do that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you would. But since we don't believe we're the one who's going to get them to believe, right? Right? We say it right out. I believe that I cannot, by my own reason or strength, believe in Jesus Christ or come to Him. Well, if I can't do it for myself, I sure as heck can't do it for you, right? That's not our business. That's the freedom of the gospel. Huh? That's the freedom of the unconditional promise. That belongs to us precisely because God promises it to us, not because we can somehow persuade ourselves to it or whatever.
Cut us off. While we're on this topic, some of you may be interested in this opportunity. As I indicated last week, Lon Olivet and myself have been in partnership with Pat for many years. Pat's the head of Church Innovations. And we are beginning a 3-year journey with Church Innovations through a program called Partnership for Missional Church.
I'll let you do that.
Which
It's always a delight to be with you.
I hope you come back again.
I hope I get invited.
Has he given us something to think about? Just a